In the beginning, when Yahweh formed the heavens and the earth, he did not merely create a world to observe. He created a relationship. Every part of creation was built upon order, purpose, and agreement. The Hebrew word that would later describe that relationship is berit, meaning covenant. It is not a casual promise or a symbolic arrangement. It is a binding partnership between the Creator and his creation, a bond of loyalty and life. When Yahweh breathed his own breath into Adam, he was not simply animating dust. He was imparting his essence, his likeness, his authority. Genesis 1 verse 26 says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them rule." From the first moment, covenant meant representation. Humanity was designed to reflect Yahweh's nature, to rule as his image bearers, walking in harmony with his will. Adam's life was meant to be the living expression of obedience. The garden itself was a covenant space, filled with provision but governed by instruction. In Genesis 2 verse 16 and 17, Yahweh said, "Of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat." The moment there was instruction, there was covenant responsibility. To remain in covenant meant to trust the boundaries Yahweh set. When Adam and Eve broke that trust, they did not just commit sin, they violated covenant order. And yet, even in judgment, Yahweh revealed his intention to restore. Genesis 3 verse 15 speaks of the seed of the woman who would crush the serpent's head. That was not merely a prophecy of victory. It was a promise that covenant would not be abandoned. Yahweh would pursue reconciliation through covenant renewal. As generations passed, wickedness filled the earth. The people forgot the covenant of creation, living by their own desires. But Yahweh found one man, Noah, who walked with God, as Genesis 6 verse 9 records. When the flood came, it was not only a punishment, it was a reset of covenant order. After the waters subsided, Yahweh established his covenant again, saying in Genesis 9 verse 11, "I will establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood." The sign was the rainbow, a visual declaration that Yahweh binds himself to his word. Notice the pattern. Yahweh always initiates covenant. It is not a human attempt to reach him. It is his invitation for humanity to walk in agreement with his will. Covenant is Yahweh's way of saying, "I am faithful, and I call you to be faithful too." From Noah, the story narrows to one man, Abram. In Genesis 12, Yahweh tells him, "Leave your country and your father's house to a land I will show you, and I will make you a great nation." Abram's response was not a confession of belief. It was obedience. He left. Covenant faith is action that aligns with instruction. In Genesis 15, Yahweh formalizes this covenant with Abram through an ancient Hebrew ritual. Animals are divided, and a smoking firepot passes between the pieces, as Yahweh declares, "To your descendants I have given this land." In Hebrew understanding, walking between the pieces symbolized death to those who break the covenant. Yahweh alone passes through, showing that he bears the full weight of the promise. But later, in Genesis 17, he gives Abram a command to walk before him and be blameless. Circumcision becomes the outward sign of covenant belonging. It is not ritual for the sake of tradition. It is a physical reminder that life and obedience are bound together. What many Hellenistic readers miss is that this covenant was never about abstract faith or mystical spirituality. It was about loyalty expressed in tangible obedience. To believe in Yahweh meant to do as he said. The covenant with Abraham was passed to Isaac, then to Jacob, who became Israel. Through them, Yahweh was forming a people who would carry his covenant identity to the world. By the time Israel was enslaved in Egypt, the covenant seemed buried under centuries of oppression. Yet Yahweh had not forgotten. In Exodus 2 verse 24, it says, God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When Yahweh remembers, it means he acts. The Exodus was not just a story of liberation, it was covenant restoration. At Sinai, the covenant reached its most detailed expression. Yahweh spoke directly to his people, saying in Exodus 19 verse 5 and 6, if you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That was the heart of it. A kingdom of priests representing Yahweh's nature to the nations. The 10 words or 10 commandments were not laws in a political sense. They were the terms of covenant relationship. Each instruction defined how to remain in harmony with Yahweh and with one another. Covenant was never about control. It was about reflection. When Yahweh said, you shall have no other gods before me, it was not because he feared competition. It was because he called his people to exclusive devotion, just as a marriage covenant demands fidelity. The prophets often compared covenant unfaithfulness to adultery, showing how breaking Yahweh's commands was breaking relationship. Even the sacrificial system was covenant in motion. Every offering, every festival, every priestly duty existed to maintain that relationship. In Leviticus 26, Yahweh promised blessings for obedience and consequences for rebellion. But in every case, he offered return. Covenant is not only about command, it is about restoration. The Hebrew world understood covenant as the center of all reality. Time itself was measured by covenant festivals. Land was divided according to covenant promise, and generations carried covenant memory. Every act of worship was a response to Yahweh's ongoing faithfulness. But something shifted when the Greco-Roman mindset began to interpret these things through its own lens. The Hellenistic world saw truth as abstract ideas, disconnected from daily obedience. They admired wisdom as philosophy, not as life practice. For them, the idea of covenant was foreign, because covenant requires submission to divine order, not just belief in divine existence. And so, when the message of Yeshua began to spread among the nations, it encountered minds trained to think differently. Where the Hebrew saw covenant as life in obedience, the Greek saw faith as mental agreement. The Hebrew heard Yahweh's voice and responded in action. The Greek discussed concepts and doctrines. That difference would become the fault line that split truth from religion. As we move toward Yeshua's time, we must hold onto this foundation. Every act of Yahweh from creation to Sinai was covenantal. Every renewal was about relationship through obedience. To understand Yeshua, we must see him through that same lens, because he did not come to start a new religion or to nullify the Torah, but to bring covenant back to life. And yet, as history unfolded, another voice would rise, a voice fluent in both Hebrew and Greek, but rooted in the Roman world, a man who would claim revelation from heaven and reshape the meaning of covenant itself. That man was Paul. When Yeshua stepped onto the scene, He did not arrive to replace what was written. He came to fulfill it. In Matthew 5 verse 17 he said clearly, "Do not think that I came to destroy the Torah or the prophets. I did not come to destroy but to fulfill." In Hebrew thought, to fulfill does not mean to end. It means to bring to fullness, to embody perfectly what was intended. Everything he did was covenant in action. When he healed the sick, it was a restoration promised in Deuteronomy 30, where Yahweh said that when his people return to him, he will restore them and bless the work of their hands. When he forgave sins, it was not to declare that the Torah no longer mattered, but to show that through repentance and obedience, the covenant relationship could be renewed. In Luke 22 verse 20, during the Passover meal, Yeshua lifted the cup and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." He was not introducing a concept foreign to Israel. He was completing what Jeremiah 31 verse 31 foretold, that Yahweh would make a renewed covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, writing his Torah on their hearts. Yeshua's blood was the sealing of that renewal, just as blood had sealed every covenant before it. To understand this, we must remember that blood in Hebrew thought symbolizes life. Leviticus 17 verse 11 says, "The life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls." Yeshua's death was the ultimate covenant offering, not a replacement of obedience, but a restoration of access. His blood did not cancel Torah. It confirmed it, demonstrating Yahweh's commitment to redeem his people even when they had failed. But the Hellenistic world could not grasp this. The idea that obedience and faith were inseparable was foreign to them. In Greek culture, the physical and spiritual were often viewed as opposites. They divided the world into body and soul, matter and spirit, law and grace. So when the message of Yeshua reached the Greco-Roman world, it was reinterpreted to fit that philosophy. Enter Paul of Tarsus, a man trained under Gamaliel in the Torah, yet also a Roman citizen fluent in Greek thought. He understood the power of influence, and he knew how to speak to Gentile minds. But in doing so, he reshaped the message. In Romans and Galatians, he repeatedly contrasts faith and law, grace and works, as if obedience to Torah were a burden rather than a relationship. To those who did not know the covenant background, his words sounded liberating. Freedom from law, freedom from restriction, freedom to believe without obligation. But to those who lived by the covenant Yahweh established, this was confusion. Yeshua said, "If you love me, keep my commandments." John 14 verse 15. Paul said, "You are not under law but under grace." Romans 6 verse 14. These are not the same messages. One calls for covenant loyalty. The other replaces covenant with belief. Paul often claimed that he became all things to all people so that he might win some. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 22. But in doing so, he blurred the distinction between obedience and acceptance. He taught Gentiles that faith alone justified them apart from Torah, creating a system where belief replaced transformation. And over time, this became the foundation of Greco-Roman Christianity, a faith about Yeshua rather than the faith of Yeshua. The Hebrew understanding was always that covenant faith is action. Abraham was counted righteous because he obeyed. Israel was called holy because they walked in Yahweh's instructions. Yeshua lived in perfect alignment with that same covenant. But under Paul's influence, the emphasis shifted. The covenant became a doctrine. The relationship became a creed. The living Torah became a theological argument. When Constantine later legalized Christianity and merged it with state power, Paul's letters became the pillars for a new religion detached from Hebrew roots. The festivals that Yahweh called his own in Leviticus 23 were replaced by Roman ones. Passover became Easter. The Sabbath was replaced by the Sunday day of Rome, and covenant obedience was replaced by ceremonial belief. The very people Yeshua came to call back into covenant were now told that Torah was a curse, and that Israel had been replaced by a universal church. But Yahweh's covenant cannot be replaced. His word is eternal. Psalm 105 verse 8 says, He remembers his covenant forever, the word he commanded to 1,000 generations. That means the covenant did not end at the cross. It found its renewal there. Yeshua did not die to end obedience, but to restore relationship, removing the barrier of sin so that we could once again walk in harmony with Yahweh's ways. Think of what Yeshua said in Matthew 7 verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father. That is covenant language. He did not say, those who believe about me, he said, those who do the will of my Father. Faith without covenant action is empty. The Greco-Roman mindset taught that salvation is a matter of intellectual agreement, saying a prayer, believing a statement, accepting a doctrine. But Yahweh's covenant requires daily faithfulness. Deuteronomy 30 verse 19 says, I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your descendants may live. Covenant is not a contract you sign once. It is a way of life you walk in. When we look back, we see how this misunderstanding has shaped centuries of religion. People were taught to see Yahweh as distant, Yeshua as the substitute, and Torah as obsolete. But in truth, Yeshua showed us how to live in Yahweh's covenant. He prayed daily, he kept the feasts, he honored the Sabbath, he taught the heart of Torah, mercy, justice, and faithfulness. When asked which command was greatest, he quoted Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19 verse 18. Love Yahweh your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. That is the entire covenant summed up. Paul's teachings, however, emphasize personal faith above collective obedience. The Hebrew covenant united families and generations in responsibility. The Greco-Roman version individualized salvation, turning it into a private matter of belief. Where the covenant built community, the new system built churches. Where Yahweh called for priests who served him through obedience, the new model created clergy who mediated belief. Yet, through all of history, Yahweh's covenant has never ceased to call. Every prophetic promise of restoration from Isaiah to Ezekiel speaks of a people returning to his ways. Ezekiel 36 verse 26 and 27 says, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and keep my judgments. That is what Yeshua came to bring. The spirit that empowers obedience, not replaces it. So when we speak of covenant today, we are not talking about an ancient Hebrew concept that has expired. We are speaking of the heartbeat of Yahweh himself. He does not change. His covenant is still the framework for relationship, the blueprint for life, and the path of restoration. To truly know Yahweh, we must return to covenant understanding, not through rituals alone, but through obedience that springs from love. As Yeshua said in John 15 verse 10, if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. Covenant is love in action. The Greco-Roman world built altars of belief, but the Hebrew world built lives of faithfulness. And that is what Yahweh is calling us back to. Not to become Jews, not to take on cultural customs for appearance, but to live as Yeshua lived, submitted, obedient, faithful, reflecting Yahweh's nature in everything we do. When we say we follow Yeshua, we are saying we walk the same path he walked. He lived by the covenant, and he calls us to do the same. The renewed covenant is not new in content. It is new in heart. It is the same Torah, the same promises, written within us through the Spirit of Yahweh. So let us no longer speak of grace as a license to ignore instruction. Let us see grace for what it truly is, the power to return to obedience. Grace is the invitation back into covenant. It is Yahweh saying, I still choose you. The time has come to tear down the walls that Paul's philosophy built between obedience and faith, to stop seeing Torah as bondage and start seeing it as freedom. Psalm 119 verse 45 says, I will walk in freedom, for I have sought your precepts. True freedom is living within the order of Yahweh's covenant, because outside of it, we serve only ourselves. Yeshua's covenant is not about religion. It is about restoration. It is the same voice that called Abraham out of Ur, that thundered from Sinai, that whispered to the prophets, and that now speaks within the hearts of those who listen. Covenant is the language of love that acts. It is Yahweh's promise that he will be our God, and we will be his people. So, can you see why understanding covenant is essential to understanding Yahweh? Without it, every scripture becomes a fragment, every teaching a theory. But through covenant, everything connects. Creation, redemption, prophecy, and eternity all revolve around this one reality. Yahweh's desire to dwell with his people in faithful relationship. We are not called to build churches. We are called to build covenant lives. We are not asked to merely believe in Yeshua, but to live as he lived, to love as he loved, to obey as he obeyed. The covenant began in creation, and it will be fulfilled in the kingdom to come, when every knee bows and every tongue confesses, not out of compulsion, but because all will finally walk in harmony with Yahweh's will. The invitation stands. Return to covenant. Return to the voice that spoke in the beginning. Return to the way of life that Yeshua lived. For Yahweh's covenant is not ancient history. It is eternal destiny.